Great. Thank you very much, Joe. And I'd like to welcome everyone here today on behalf of the Geospatial Commission to talk about the work we've been looking at with our partners around sort of like data improvement, what this means, and the outputs of some of the practical projects that we've done in this area. It's a panel discussion. It's going to be quite sort of like relaxed to get an open discussion going about what we got from the program, the tangible results, and a look forwards to the sort of things we could do in terms of the next steps. So if you can move on to the next slide.
Sorry. I'm trying to do two things at once. It's not working. Okay, has that worked?
Yeah, it hasn't sort of like, yeah, it's moved on. So Joe's covered the housekeeping. So thank you very much, Joe and Northern Survey, for hosting this on our behalf. I'm going to give a little bit of background to what we're talking about today, and also just to give you an update of the structure. We're going to have 3 questions that we're going to put to the panel. They're going to respond to that. Opportunity after that to invite you, the audience, to drop your questions in for the panel. And afterwards, we'll have a quick wrap up and talk about where we're going to go to next. So on to the next slide, please, Joe. So most of you on the call are aware of the Geospatial Commission, who we are, what we do. So we're established in 2018 as an expert committee, and we are part of the Cabinet Office. Our mission is really to sort of like pull together geospatial data as a whole across all of the UK to both advance how we deliver data and, more importantly, to realise benefits of geospatial data to economy, society in general. We're doing that through a whole series of activities, and these have been articulated in our strategy that was recently sort of like published, which sets our 5-year plans going forward. The important thing with the plan, it's quite wide-ranging in terms of how it sort of like looks at improvements, but it covers 4 main sort of like fundamental principles, which is about ensuring that what we do is use and value driven, that we are looking at the whole system, so the whole gambit of sort of like how data actually is created, stored, used, and consumed within society. It's a collaborative process, and it's also an iterative process. And I think the collaboration is key to this, because if we move on to the next slide, please, Joe. You know, the Geospatial Commission does have formal arrangements with its 6 partner bodies sort of listed here, and we work across and between each of those organisations to look at how geospatial data can be advanced across the UK. And this is quite an interesting challenge because, you know, different organisations operate in different ways, have different business models, but they all provide sort of like geospatial data, and that's the common thread that we're trying to sort of like knit together when we're looking in terms of data improvement. So if you move on to the next slide, please, Joe. And this really leads us into what we want to talk today. We've tried to do a tangible program of work that tackles this question of sort of like data improvement, trying to understand sort of like what it means, what practical steps we can take. It's a very large spectrum covering a large different activities. And this represents our first dip into the data improvement pool to look at what a cross UK, cross Geo6 improvement activities could look like. And today, the panel is going to be talking about what they found from the program, their experiences, and some practical examples of the sort of like the benefits that came out of it. So I'd like to now sort of you to introduce the panel to you, who are going to be giving their time today. So if we move on to the next slide, Joe, we have 4 very illustrious sort of panel members. I'm sure they are well known to a lot of you around the table. We have Lisa Allen from the ODI, Hugh Phillips from the UK Hydrographic Office, Jerry Wildman from BGS, and Nicole Firth from Ordnance Survey. What I'd like to do now is give each of the panel members an opportunity to quickly introduce themselves before we move on to the first sort of like panel question. So I'll go around each of you in turn. Lisa.
Hi all, it's great to be here. Yeah, so I'm Lisa Allen. I'm the head of consultancy for data programs at the Open Data Institution. Can't speak today, but I was formerly Ordnance Survey and head of data, and I was the sponsor for the data improvement programs that was running when I was there.
Thanks, Lisa. And Hugh?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hugh Phillips. I'm now back at UKHO as the head of customer strategy and innovation, but I was previously at the Geospatial Commission as the head of data and standards, and in that role I was the sponsor for the whole programme of work under the data improvement programme.
Thanks, Hugh. And Jerry?
Yeah, hi everybody. So Jerry Wildman of the BGS. My role at BGS is about facilitating the supply of our data outwards to our customers. So data licensing is a part of my role, as is trying to make sure we've got the right sort of balance of open data as well. So so my role within the GeoSix projects was to lead the licensing projects, and it was an interesting project. We'll talk more about it, I'm sure, as the panel goes on. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. And Nicole.
Thanks, Kieran. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nicole Frith. I work at the Ordnance Survey, previously worked with Lisa very closely. I've recently moved into our consumer team, but when I worked on the GeoSix projects, I was leading the data discoverability project. So I worked on that for the past 2 years, which really looked at trying to make data more findable, making sure it's catalogued, and making sure that the metadata helped people to understand whether the data was fit for their purpose.
Brilliant. So thank you to all four of you for giving up your time today to share your thoughts around sort of like data improvement. And to start off with, I mean, data improvement, no one could argue with data improvement as a sort of like concept. Everybody wants sort of like better data. But when you start to get into the detail of that and what you actually have to do, it could mean everything. It could be huge things, or it could mean nothing. So I'd like to just start by asking you, what do you understand about sort of like data improvements, and what does that mean in practice? And particularly, are there any particular nuances around geospatial data that makes it stand out from other types of data? I'll start off with you, Lisa, to see what your views on that are.
Yeah, so I think geospatial data is a fundamental asset, not just for GB but and UK, but actually for the world, isn't it? I mean, it's essential to tackle things like climate change, our response to disease, and the economy. And we've seen it come out through the COVID crisis as well. So I always think about it that geospatial is an important data infrastructure. So it's in the same class as the roads or the railways, isn't it? So if you're thinking about how we need to improve it, then I think it's about making sure we're removing those points of friction caused by various things like licensing or standards, or people not even be able to find the data. And it's also about understanding why geospatial, I suppose, is so important, because it's so underpinning, and it supports many ecosystems, so data ecosystems. So it's making sure that data is fit for those users. And I think it's a use case that keeps moving forward too, isn't it? All these things keep changing. So like now, data ethics is important in geospatial too. So I think it's it needs to be seen as that fundamental asset, or a fundamental infrastructure, and treated as such to make sure it's fit for purpose.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Now, the idea of like data as an infrastructure, I mean, that's quite a sort of like an interesting concept. But I like the idea is something there that we have to underpin it, and if we don't look after it, like your roads analogy, it will wear out and won't serve us sort of like going forward. What do you think, Hugh, about sort of like improvements? I mean, you can perhaps look at it from both sides, both from your view in the Geospatial Commission, but also more practically, also from the sort of like marine side as well, which might be seen as a different relation compared to the sort of traditional sort of like land use view of data.
So I think one of the things I learned very early on at the Commission was that actually a huge amount of the things we talked about as issues around geospatial data were actually just issues around data, full stop. So I could be having the same conversation with a bunch of housing people, or with a bunch of energy people, or the same basic issues apply in all cases. So a lot of improving data is about implementing good data management. And I think related to that is actually you can burn a lot of effort and time and money improving things, but unless you understand what you're improving it for and who you're improving it for, then you're in danger of wasting that effort. So I think one of the key things in any improvement program is really understanding what your customers want, what the users need, and therefore which aspects of data you need to improve. And then I think the sort of the third element for me around that is sort of touching on something that Nicole mentioned in her introduction. Actually, to some degree, at the moment, we've got lots of data. What we haven't got is lots of really good metadata. So actually helping people to find the right data and helping people to understand whether that data is fit for their purpose, that is probably a bigger area of focus for me at the moment than actually more data. In the marine environment, there are definitely gaps in our data. We definitely need to capture more data, but actually helping people find the data that's already there and understand what it can and can't be used for, I think is almost more important at this stage.
Okay, thanks, Hugh. And I'd actually like to sort of like perhaps move the next question to Nicole on the same sort of question around sort of like improvements. But I guess with sort of like Ordnance Survey as a sort of product-driven business, improvements are kind of built into your sort of like DNA. And I'm just wondering, in terms of things that we should do for improvements, are there things we perhaps shouldn't be doing for improvements as well? Things which we should sort of like even park to one side as well as the things we should be considering. So yeah, please feel free to the wider question, but I'm also interested by things what isn't data improvement?
That's a great question, Kieran. I think that sort of building on what Hugh said, in many cases, there's a lot of very good quality data that exists, particularly within Ordnance Survey. We do have really great data holdings. And I think it is about that kind of stepping back and seeing it in the holistic round, and kind of off the back of that and understanding how the world is changing, how user needs are changing, making sure that effort is prioritized, because we can't do everything. And I think the kind of aspect on that is understanding where your role is and where there's maybe other organizations that can come in and add value as well. So understanding what's the real kind of thing you should be investing in, and what are those biggest barriers to entry. So we do know that we have very good quality data. That doesn't mean it can't be improved, but actually some of the investment also needs to be in making it more accessible to new markets, making it more usable, making it perhaps less niche. I think sometimes geospatial data or the geospatial industry is quite niche, and we are seeing a big trend. More people are understanding the value of it. They don't know all the nuances. And actually, so it might be that it's not so much investing in the data itself, but helping people to realize the value and find that data and use it through different tools or in a different way where they've maybe had different technologies and software. So I think it's about really understanding how you can maximize the value of any investments you make. And that might not be in more data capture or new attribution. It could be in actually the entire wrapper or the way that you package that up and make that available. Great,
thanks, Nicole. And sort of like Jerry, I know sort of like licensing is a key aspect that you're involved with as well. And I'm interested in the sort of like the business process and the terms side of sort of like data improvements, because sometimes you hear this phrase, licensing is bad, but licensing can be an enabler to actually helping people use sort of like data as well. So I'm just wondering about data improvements from the terms and conditions perspective.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kieran. Quite often licensing is seen as something that's a barrier to access, but actually from where I sit in the conversations I've had with the licensing teams across the GS6, licensing is actually a facility to open up data that would previously be locked away. And there will be any number of reasons why we would potentially sort of restrict access to data, whether it be, you know, there's third-party constraints, or there may be some national security or fraud issues associated with the data set, so we'd want to know who was using it. So licensing actually enables us to find a way of supplying those data sets that otherwise would be locked away. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there, is around licensing. And this is what we're trying to do, is change the language and change people's perceptions that it's more of an enabler than a blocker.
Okay. So thanks, everybody. I mean, that's, you know, what we've seen is we've got a bit of a broad, you know, there's a lot of factors around sort of like improvements, from the nuts and bolts of the data itself, you know, the fundamental things that we often look about good things about data, like its accuracy, its precision, its coverage. But then there's also factors around you know, how it can be used, how it can be discovered through interoperability, through metadata, how it can be structured to make it more interoperable. And as what Jerry's sort of like picked up as well, is also making sure that you've got the right business processes in place to actually make sure you can have all those things working together. So I think with all those sort of different factors in place, I think it'll be quite good to perhaps move on to our sort of like next question, to understand how we could have used the FAIR sort of concept to look at the data improvement issues that we needed to make. So most of you are probably familiar with the sort of like the FAIR principles, that data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and sort of like reusable. And that is something that did get looked at in the data improvement program, but we also sort of like extended that into the concept of sort of like QFAIR as well, which people may not be so familiar with. So perhaps I'd like to ask Hugh if he can give a little bit of a background around how FAIR can be used as a tool to look at data improvements, and why we extended it into the concept of QFAIR. I think Nicole's going to put a little slide up as well, actually, that might help people.
Okay, so I think the slide that's been put up is to sort of try and illustrate how FAIR kind of builds up as a sort of as a set of principles that enable you to do interesting and exciting things with data. And the analogy that I've used in the past with this is that there's a sort of a hierarchy of data needs, in the same sense that Maslow talks about the hierarchy of needs in sort of marketing terms. So for anyone who's not familiar with that, what Maslow basically says is that, you know, a person can't reach their full potential as a human being if they're spending all their time worrying about more functional, fundamental issues like, where do I get food from, and how do I get shelter, and how do I get protection. If that's taking all your time up, then, you know, you can't really focus on self-improvement and those other things. And in the same way, there is a sort of a hierarchical element to the FAIR principles. So if I've got a problem, if I'm looking to solve a problem, then the first thing I need to do is find some data to help me solve that problem. If I can't find the data, then I've either got to go and get it for myself, you know, capture it from first principles, which is difficult and expensive, or else I just give up, basically. If I know data exists, but I can't access it, either because of licensing conditions, or it's wrapped up in a proprietary system, or it's hidden behind a firewall, then again, I've either got to go capture it from scratch myself, or else I've got to, you know, again, give up. If I get hold of a data set, that's great, but, you know, most problems, most activities that we do with data require, you know, more than one data set to really solve the problem. So being able to join that data set up, either by just overlaying it in a sort of geographical way, or by combining it through attributes and identifiers, you know, that's where you start really adding value. But then at the top level, you've also got to understand the whole concept of, is this data that I'm using the right data, can I reuse it for the purpose that I want to reuse it for? And that sort of then leads you into the quality bits, the Q bit. And I think quality around data for me is one of the most misused words. We all fall into the trap, I think, of talking about good and bad quality data as if there's some absolute measure of that. For me, what we're really talking about is metadata. Again, it's about describing data in a way that enables a user to determine whether that data is fit for their purpose. And I talked earlier on about understanding your users, and that's obviously really important. But I think one thing we've got to recognise is we are never going to know all of the different uses that our data is put to, and therefore you can't design data that meets all purposes. So the only solution you've got as a data owner is to describe your data in the most accurate, precise and easy to understand way as you can, so that anybody coming to that data set can understand what they can and can't use it for. So that's kind of the Q-FAIR thing. I mean, I think in terms of, it is a set of principles. It's not a maturity model. I think it's a useful set of principles to understand and to follow. But for me, there also isn't necessarily an absolute right answer in any of those categories. There are lots of ways of doing things, and different things are appropriate for different purposes. So, but it's definitely a useful framework to think about how you make your data more shareable and available to people.
Thanks, Hugh. So, question to sort of Nicole: the FAIR approach to sort of like data sharing, or extending it out into the Q-FAIR approach, how do you see that sort of like working from an OS sort of like perspective? Is it a model that you use, and what sort of benefits can you see from its application?
Thanks, Kieran. So yeah, we do use this within OS. We also have a set of data principles which are very much aligned, and as the Q-FAIR model has been increasingly used by the Geospatial Commission, we've essentially aligned those across. So each one of our principles, which we group into the concepts of trust, find and use, we also now have a kind of alignment with the Q-FAIR, and they naturally did sit together because, as Hugh said, they're very, in the very simple sense, it's a very logical framework. It makes sense to a lot of people, and I think that's the other thing, is that within Ordnance Survey, so many people touch our data in so many different ways through the kind of end-to-end data journey. And one of the things that I really like about the Q-FAIR framework is, regardless of exactly how it's defined in different definitions, as fundamental principles, they're understandable, and that means it can be understood by kind of the more technical people as well as the more strategic people who maybe are positioning the data within the market or understand the need to make that data more available. So it works from almost for everyone. It feels like for each aspect there's a kind of hook into it for someone within the Ordnance Survey. So whether that's our field surveyors, who are very focused on making sure that the data is the best quality, that we've got up to date, precise, accurate data, right through to the people who manage our fulfillment and our licensing, can hook into the findable and accessible, and so it kind of works through the whole thing. And one of the things that I really like about it is, yeah, we can define things and have drop downs into measures and what have you, but as principles they feel quite relatable. They're words that we can understand and find how that works within each different team and organisation. No, not organisation, department, sorry.
And Lisa, I mean, I think what we've heard is that the concepts about Q-FAIR are not new. I mean, they've been around for a while, but I think the thing what resonates with the term sort of FAIR is not only does it actually spell out a nice word, but it also sort of like puts it in a way that conveys something more sort of like conveys complicated things in a quite a simple way that people can sort of like relate to. In the wider sort of world of sort of like open data, I mean, how do you see those FAIR principles? I mean, I guess it's just not unique to sort of like geospatial. It's something that can act as a bit of a thread across all data for all decision making?
Yeah, so you do see it used in wider. I think also what comes in, other people, because obviously with FAIR, we've had the Q FAIR onto it. Others principles, there's CARE. So as well, and that's thinking about things like for collective benefit and like responsibility, and it also adds in ethics there too. So I think these principles, when you look at them in conjunction, are beneficial to the wider group. And I think it's interesting when you think about FAIR, because I think Nicole's point of that it's easy to understand, I think it gets across the basic principles, doesn't it? And I think anybody knows in data management that there's more. But if it gets people engaged in the basic principles, and then if we can build on some of the additional things like the ethics and quality side of things, then I think then that helps translate something that's quite complex into something that then is quite simple. And I think Hugh had a really good point as well about our data, because we think about it as two types. When you think about how people are using data, I mean, you've got the original users of the data, and that's the primary purpose for that data. But then you've got the reusers of the data, and they might be people that actually that data wasn't intended for that purpose. So that's where it's really interesting to make sure that in the quality of QFAIR that you're really stating what that purpose was for, because actually that reuse may or may not be fit for that purpose. And it's easy to, throw stones at a data set when you use it, because it actually wasn't made for your purpose. So yeah, I think FAIR, when you couple it with other principles out there, can be a useful translation for people. But I think in building it for data management, I think the data management specialists will probably need to take it to an extra level to make sure that we're really looking at those data improvements and looking after the data.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And yes, I think what I like about the FAIR and maybe other frameworks is it starts to sort of show that data is sort of multifaceted. It helps bridge that question, oh, data isn't good enough. Well, you can then start to sort of decompose to understand how does that mean, what does that actually sort of like mean in practice. And I'd like to also ask the same question to sort of like Jerry as well, about how practically from sort of like BGS you see sort of like FAIR used as an operational context. Maybe you haven't called it FAIR, but you've been adopting those principles over the years.
Yeah, certainly we have. And I think the one of the issues that we have within BGS, and I think some of the other organisations will have the same thing, is we have such a tremendous back catalogue of data. We've been storing data, for tens, if not hundreds of years potentially, and trying to retrospectively apply the QFAIR principles is a real challenge for us, and we can't lie. But what we have actually, or what we are starting to do, is to bring in QFAIR at the start of projects rather than look at it at the end, because QFAIR does take some investment. So increasingly now we're thinking about the principles at the start before we create a data set, or as we're creating it, and then managing those expectations and the principles that throughout the duration of the project. And so in so doing, hoping to almost sort of future-proof our existing data sets, and make sure that we can facilitate the supply and get the maximum use out of our data resources in the future.
Great. And I'd like to stay with you, sort of, Jerry, to sort of perhaps move on to the sort of like the next questions, which are around some of the practical things that were looked at as part of the sort of like the data improvement program. And if you could just give a little bit of background of some of the work that was done through sort of like BGS, and how the projects relate to the FAIR principles of sharing data.
Yeah, thank you. So licensing, I mean, we've talked about before, it really, okay, it's either an enabler or a restrictor to access, but it really is around providing access to data that potentially you wouldn't be able to get to. And I think one of the things that we identified throughout the project is there's a bit of what we called a data licensing literacy gap. So quite often people weren't sure what they could do with the data once they got hold of it. So pretty much we all have licensing regimes, and we could pass data in some form onto the end user. But then there was a confusion about how that data could then be accessed and used. So we spent a lot of time speaking to users of data to try to understand what their issues are. And one of the things that we introduced was, well, firstly, we looked at trying to harmonise as many of our terms as possible within our licences, so that people would start to see that familiarity of licensing terms and start to understand what they could do with the data a bit more. And we also introduced some what we called plain English front page terms, so that which were predominantly geared towards the data user rather than the legal teams. Because what we were finding again was that the license was read by the legal teams and understood by the legal teams, but not necessarily by the user. So when the user got hold of the data, they weren't quite sure what they could do with it, and quite often would just put it to one side and pick up some open data and use that instead, because they quite clearly knew what they could do with open data. So we did spend a lot of time on trying to make sure that the licenses could be read by a data user. We put some licensing guidance together as well, which we're hoping will be particularly useful. And I think possibly looking at the reuse element around what happens when somebody has created some data from licensed data, some derived data. Again, we spent some time as the licensing teams looking at what our derived data policies were. So again, and this really is, well, I mean, it links into quite a few of the FAIR principles. You know, if somebody's created a derived data policy using any number of third-party data sets, they've got to potentially get to grips with 3 or 4 or possibly, you know, many different licensing terms, as many different licensing terms as data sets. So trying to have a consistent approach to derived data, trying to make sure that people are quite clear about what they could do with it, we're hoping will increase access and increase the reuse as well.
Great. And I mean, I think the derived data is a very sort of interesting stuff area, because you, as you say, people think about merging data sets, but you're merging the license terms that come with those data sets as well. And is there any consideration about sort of like licensing, and is there a protection that you get with licensed data rather than just using sort of like data which you just discover off the internet? I mean, would you say that?
That's a really loaded question, isn't it? That gets down into liabilities. I don't think I'm qualified potentially to answer that. But it is interesting because, you know, there is an assumption that
I think it's
something
the lineage you get with the licensing terms of showing where data has come from.
Yes, yeah, but I think potentially the same could be said of open data, and I think we do need to be careful as publishers to put as much care into the data we release as open to the data that we release under commercial terms, because people will use it within their own businesses and to make their own decisions. So yeah, I think that there does need to be a certain amount of care we apply to both our open and our commercial products.
Great. So I don't want to put you on the spot there. Actually, it's thanks a lot for the sort of like the contributions on that. And like licensing, I think we continue to be involved as part of the sort of like the FAIR framework to look at what it means and getting that balance between using it as a tool to promote access and promote sort of reuse, but in a structured way. I think is how I would summarise it.
Yeah.
And moving on to Nicole, with the sort of projects that you were looking at with OS for sort of like the data improvement. I mean, there was a number of projects. I mean, could you just run us through a couple which you've particularly resonated with you?
Yeah, so I worked very closely on the data discoverability project, which was all about, I guess it sort of in first principles was all kind of focused on the findable aspect of FAIR. But I think what we increasingly realised is it went above and beyond that. So it definitely touched on all of the different aspects, because one of the examples might be that data might not be open, but in describing that data exists, maybe there is a need for that data that you didn't realise, and maybe that does help to kind of shift the dial and make more data available for uses that you didn't previously foresee. So it kind of did touch across all of them. But fundamentally, what it was really focused on was understanding how people search for and find data and how they understand how it's described. And the outcome of that was creating a series of data catalogues which broke down the data holdings of the Geo6. And over the course of the project, that capability was increasingly matured. So we went from initially producing just some CSV files, and then by the end of the project, this had been matured to align with the metadata standards, the Gemini standard, and also to actually have catalogue services that meant that we could actually bring those catalogues together across the Geo6. And so it just made, as a series of organisations, us much more closely aligned. And I think one of the things that really became clear for me through the course of the project, because we did a lot of user research, so interviews, surveys, kind of observation tasks to see how people looked for data, was actually that I think there can sometimes be a bit of a disconnect between what we think we're doing as organisations and what our customers and users are doing to try to find that data, and things that maybe we think are blindly obvious. You know, if you want data about GB, go to Ordnance Survey, or, you know, the land in GB, go to Ordnance Survey, isn't necessarily clear when users and customers, and particularly new users and customers, are entering that industry. So some of the other things that we did around that were looking at search engine optimization, because we saw that the majority of people started their discovery journey with a Google search, and very few of them clicked off the first page. So if you don't appear, then you maybe don't even get to the data that you need, and Google can't understand the data itself, so has to rely on the metadata. But we also looked at things like breaking down jargon, similarly to what Jerry was saying. We found that across the Geo6 we used similar terms differently, or had different words for the same meaning. So by kind of consolidating that and making that a bit more joined up, it makes the Geo6, which we understand as separate organisations, but which perhaps customers just see as kind of geospatial organisations in GB or in the UK, you know, why it doesn't really matter to them that if they need above the ground, go to OS, if they need below the ground, go to BGS. They just want information about a place. And that means that having those kind of synergies and alignments helps to hopefully simplify that journey.
Thanks, Nicole. And I particularly like that work that was done around search engine optimization, because it does sort of bridge that gap between the way that people look for data through general search engines versus they don't go to their portal of choice and then put in their sort of like normal keywords to look for data. So I think that's a really exciting step in that direction to basically improve the discoverability and accessibility of the data. And Lisa, were there any particular projects that you worked on with data improvement that particularly sort of like resonated with you as bringing forward improvements to how we get benefit from data in the UK?
Yeah, so I think thinking about some of the stuff that that Jerry said, you know, because in the Open Data Institute we talk about the data sharing spectrum. So actually the work between that Nicole and Jerry were doing, and when I was there too, was actually looking at the join up between these things. So the Geo6 are really vitally important for holding some of the GB's best geospatial data infrastructure, aren't they? You know, there's an amazing group of organisations, and having that data, being able to people be able to find it. So using those terms that Nicole said, you know, is amazing. Just looking at those plain English terms that and how we could improve in the Geo6 to make that easier. But then looking at that data sharing spectrum. So not all data can be open. There are some stuff that should be available to all, but then you move up those ranks, and that data sharing assessment then meant that actually there was a consistent approach across the Geo6 to looking at sharing that data into that wider ecosystem. And that might mean it needs licensing, it might mean that it can go out as open. But I think just that consistency really helps people, and it starts on the journey, doesn't it, of organisations working together, and it levels the playing field between organisations and between users, because they'll know what to expect. So I think for me, looking at the pushing forward the organisations and the benefit to the UK or to GB, I think that was the one that stood out for me more, about that consistency and making sure we're sharing more of that data and people know what they're looking for and they can understand it. So the join up between those, I think, was great.
Yeah, and I guess also it comes back to that question of people are looking for geospatial data. They don't know it's distributed across 6 people, 6 organizations. So the more you can have consistency of how data is released and they can understand why it's released, it just brings that whole conversation forward. So I think that was another great piece of work. Hugh, what were your favorite outcomes of the sort of like the data improvement program, and maybe on particular projects, or maybe even looking across the whole program as a whole?
So yeah, I mean, I guess as the project sponsor, that's kind of a bit like asking me to pick my favourite child. But there were a lot of really good outcomes. I mean, you know, in terms of, we had the kind of 2 projects that ran throughout. So the data discoverability project had sort of 3 iterations and did a huge amount of work. I mean, we've talked a bit about there the search engine optimization, but we had also the data sharing risk assessment tool, which was really valuable and something we use at UKHO. We did a lot of work around what does authoritative mean, and I think that's a really useful piece of work. I think yet to sort of maybe find its feet, or find its use, but I think ultimately something really useful, and some really simple things like something that Howard Askew led on, which was just, where do I go and look for data? Because actually, I think the average user doesn't even think I'm looking for geospatial data. They think I'm looking for something on this topic, you know. And actually, at the moment, government is designed to hide stuff, you know, with all the different organisations and different types of organisations and, you know, arm's length bodies and all this. Where do you even start looking? So just a simple list of this organisation has this type of data, I think, is a really useful thing. You know, the licensing work that Jerry's talked about is really good, and something again that we've benefited from at UKHO. You know, bit that I'm quite interested in is kind of machine readable licensing. You know, how do you move from something which requires a lawyer to read to something that you can feed into an IT system, and throughout the journey of that data through the system. And also when we talk about derived products, you know, you can then flow through into a derived product the different terms and conditions from different data sets that are used. You know, the more you can automate that, the less likely it is that people are going to infringe or use data which they shouldn't use for the wrong purposes. So, you know, really good work there. I mean, we looked at in unique identifiers. We did a lot of work on that, and again another concept which I think is really interesting, but hasn't really sort of hasn't landed yet widely, because I think it's probably a bit sophisticated for where a lot of our users are. But how do you share? You know, when you're joining data sets up, a lot of these joins are done ad hoc and within projects, and then they're thrown away and redone every time. And we did a big piece of work led by Sanjay Rana at VOA, which was around how do you share these? How do you make a join once authoritatively and then share it with people? And again, I think that's time will, you know, it will find its time, that, because I think it's a really useful piece of work. And then my colleague Roger Skelly did a great piece of work in the marine environment, looking at how the various different organisations that collect and use data within the marine environment could be better coordinated, and we could get more, you know, collective bang for our buck in terms of that, you know, particularly hydrographic, bathymetric, and environmental data in the marine environment. And that project really pulled together, it sparked a lot of interest. I think we pulled together about 15 different organisations, most of which are not kind of GEO6 organisations, and you know, there was really a lot of enthusiasm there for doing something differently and better in the future. Yeah, I mean, it was a very broad, wide set of projects, and you know, all of them were really interesting. And you know, I think I'd like to thank everybody who took part in them. I guess a number of people are on this call who actually got involved in those projects, and you know, it was really only through the engagement and enthusiasm of the leads, and also all the people who took part in the workshops and activities, that we really got the program to the point we did. So you know, I'd like to say thank you for everyone's support on that.
Thanks, Hugh. Also, I can see that in the chat, Paul has posted a link to where you can get hold of some of these best practice sort of like guidance as well. You can also find it on the on our website as well. So we're going to move on to sort of some questions that have been sort of like raised in the chat, and I'd like to pick up on the question posed by Tamsin around how do you actually sort of like encourage organizations to understand about the importance of quality data, quality metadata? And I'm using that in the context of making sure it's appropriate, but also I'd like to think about it in the context of QFair. How can you have QFair in the data if you don't have that sort of like underpinning approach in the organization to what that has those mechanisms in place to ensure that you can apply QFair principles to sort of like the data sets that you have? So I'm going to go to Lisa, actually, to first of all to sort of like answer that sort of question. How can we get that culture of encouraging data for reuse?
Yes, I think it comes back to data literacy, really, and organisations understanding what an asset data is for them. It's been interesting at the ODI. I've been doing some work with the Institute of Directors to get it at that level about data governance. It's the first time in my whole career that I've actually sat down and voluntarily trained directors who wanted to be there on data governance. So I think things are really changing, actually, and that's good to see. You know, at the start of my career, I used to have to chase the directors to talk to me about data, but now actually the whole COVID crisis has shown that this is changing, that data is an asset. So I think it's right that we need to educate people to make sure everyone's got a certain level of data literacy in an organisation, and then you can go from managing the risks which people normally associate to actually really exploiting the opportunities, because there's lots of opportunities if you share data. So I think it's really about that understanding the literacy within an organisation, making sure you're managing it so you can get the value and the opportunities by managing it well.
Great. And picking up on that sort of, Nicole, resonating with what Lisa was saying earlier about sort of data as an infrastructure, does it mean that people see that they have a stake in making sure that they have to contribute to the overall data infrastructure so they can reap the benefits from it?
Sorry, just stuck on mute. My laptop's been playing okay today. Sorry, if you just repeat the question.
Yeah, so it's about making sure that if we have the concept as sort of data as a sort of infrastructure, people realise that they've got a stake in making sure that they have to share in order to reap the benefits themselves from their data publications. So if you don't share, you don't get the benefits.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. And I think the more that we can find those data stories that really bring that to life, the better. So whether that is a customer who's been able to do something, and like Lisa said, the COVID pandemic has really highlighted that, or whether that's working in collaboration with other organisations and realising that actually, you know, it's that kind of share and share back, and you end up ultimately realising a better outcome. I think that bringing those data stories to life throughout the whole, throughout the whole ecosystem, whether that is someone who's just been able to make a decision and get the bus on time, or whether that's someone who's been able to forecast what's going to happen in climate change. It's a whole spectrum, but it means that everyone can then understand that and can share back how that data has helped them to realise a decision or an outcome, or make efficiencies in their work or life. And that's really, I think, how you try to make that tangible. So finding those data stories that aren't just metrics, we made 10,000 improvements, or we spent this much investment and saved this much, but actually making it really real with stories that bring it to life.
Great, thanks. I'd like to move on to looking at time, but we have got time for a sort of like another sort of question. I'd like to pick up on the question that Michael Howe's been sort of raised around sort of QFair and Inspire. I'm reading that as a broader question along the lines of, well, there's a number of frameworks out there. There's things like Inspire, there's IGIF, and in the marine sector, there's sort of like MEDIN. How do we see things like QFair as a tool that sort of sits alongside those initiatives? I don't personally myself, I don't see it as a competing concept or anything like that. I see it more as an enabler to support the objectives of these bigger pictures. Hugh, what do you think?
So yeah, no, I entirely agree. I mean, to me, IGIF is the big picture. That is the overall kind of framework for, you know, MSD, or in our case, Marine Spatial Data Infrastructure, but SDI, if you like, that covers, you know, the 9 boxes cover governance, organizations, data, technology, you know, all the different aspects of it. And I think when you look at things like Medin or Gemini, or, you know, even Inspire, and the FAIR principles, they don't address the majority of those boxes. They address parts of some of those boxes. So Gemini and Medin are very much metadata standards. They fall heavily within the data/technology boxes, I guess, and they are one way of implementing a good, you know, structured data part of your IGIF kind of framework, if you like. You know, Inspire covers a slightly wider range of boxes. It covers a bit about governance and some of those other things. But again, it's just because the thing about IGIF is it doesn't tell you how to do things. It tells you the types of things you need to do, and what these, you know, what Inspire and Gemini and QFAIR start to do is to tell you, okay, this is a way of achieving that outcome that IGIF recommends for that sector. So, you know, I think, you know, in sort of the Geospatial Commission's vision, it talks about a coherent location framework, and I think that's what this is about. This is about, for the UK, how do we agree which are the things that we fit in each of those boxes that give the UK that kind of coherent framework. And I think, you know, Gemini, Medin, Inspire, FAIR, you know, those are starting to tick the box in terms of what does good look like for us in each of those, in some of those sections. And then it's a question of going around the other parts of that, you know, 9-box grid and saying, well, what do we need here? What do we need in ethics? What do we need in governance? You know, so yeah, very much compatible, not competing for me.
Great. And Jerry, do you agree with that as how we see things like QFAIR and wider frameworks?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think anything that promotes, anything that encourages people to think more than just about the data, about the things that you need to wrap around it to get it used more and get the maximum benefit out of it, is great for me as far as I'm concerned. So the overlaps or the complements between the different initiatives, I'm not too concerned about. I just think let's just keep pushing that message out and get people thinking about the ways in which they can increase access to their data and increase the usability of their data. Because as I say, I mean, at BGS, we're quite hung up on the quality elements. We're quite hung up on making sure our scientific data is as good as it possibly can be. It's the bits you wrap around that are the bits that you know we really need to have a think about and a focus on in order to, you know, to see the sort of step change that we think is out there.
Brilliant, great. And to sort of conclude, I think one of the things that I really took away as one of the big benefits from the data improvement programme is that it identified things that needed to be done, but it also had mechanisms for then implementing those things as well to bring about the sort of change. And so I'd just like a quick sort of like sentence from sort of each of you. If we wanted to look at QFAIR as a sort of like or this sort of approach as a sustained basis, how can we do it? What do we actually need to do to make sure we're looking at this as continuous sustained improvement rather than just a sort of like a one-off project? So I just need a sentence from each of you in turn. I'll start with you, Jerry.
So as far as licensing is concerned, I think one of the great benefits of the improvement programme has been linking up with the other GeoSix partners. And I think as far as license is concerned, we're going to continue to keep those connections together and that community together, and see it. And we've managed to get the buy-in of our senior managers as well, so that we can continue that process of certainly the accessibility and the reuse piece throughout the foreseeable, really.
And Lisa, how can we sustain this going forward, or what should we do to sustain it going forward?
I think it's about working together, and I think it's about publicly talking about it and monitoring your progress and talking to users. I think that's going to be having it in the public domain. I think is a really good thing to keep driving that enhancement forward.
Right. And Nicole, we've clearly seen the benefits of, you know, collaborative working to address common issues in this space. What do you see as what we need to do next?
I was just was going to say, not to echo Jerry and Lisa, but I think one of the best things is that collaboration. I think one of the unsung heroes of the whole programme is that we have joined organisations together. The fact that even everyone's on this call, we couldn't have probably done a few years ago. The first project was like, how do we physically work together and share things? And I think above and beyond anything we've delivered, having that relationship, seeing what other organisations are doing, learning from each other where different organisations have their strengths, and sharing that knowledge and expertise is just absolutely vital. And I think one of the best outcomes has been those networks that have been built across the organisations to keep this moving forward.
Great. And I guess here you'd agree with that. We need to sort of like keep the momentum going forward that was developed through the energy that we got out of the DIP.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I absolutely agree that the collaboration has been one of the big winners. I mean, for me though, I think it's also about recognizing that just improving stuff for the Geo6 doesn't, that's not necessarily going to give you all the benefit you need. There is geospatial data and there's data across governments, and I think for me it would probably be more beneficial to get everybody up to a kind of a level 2 in a maturity model than ending up with any one organization to level 5. So I think it's about, it's about continuing to evangelize, if you like, the benefits and the needs, and almost sort of making the business case for people. So it was interesting, Lisa talking about chief directors and people coming to her for data governance. I still think there is, they hold the purse strings. Those are the people we've got to persuade that the work needs to be done, because it's not glamorous work and it's not big shiny projects. It is grunt work at the bottom level that needs to be done to get most of the benefits going, really.
Great. So it's 11 o'clock. I thank you all very much for coming along today. I'd like to extend my personal thanks to the panel members and to Joe for sort of like organising it. A link will be sent out in due course as to how you can access this and relive at your leisure. But just reminds me to say thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.